Hello and welcome. I'm Cheyenne Daniels, race and politics reporter at The Hill. Thank you for joining me for our show, Walk to Freedom Turns 60, Miles to Go, a discussion on the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The program is being put on in partnership with my podcast, The Switch Up, which you can listen to on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you normally get your podcasts. 60 years ago, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom saw Martin Luther King Jr. give his iconic I Have a Dream speech. Both the march and the speech were seminal moments, instrumental in the passage of the Watershed Civil Rights Act of 1964. But where does the fight for equal opportunity and civil rights stand today? Our speakers will tackle a number of issues exploring the evolution of achieving liberty and justice for all Americans. We have an incredible lineup of speakers today, but before we get to them, just a few quick housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag The Hill March on Wash. My first guests are Martin Luther King III, chairman of the Drum Major Institute, and his wife, Andrea Waters King, the president of the Drum Major Institute, a social justice organization. They're both passionate leaders in the global fight against inequity and injustice. Thank you both so much, Mr. and Mrs. King, for being here today as we celebrate and recognize and honor the 60th anniversary for the March on Washington. It's incredible that we are 60 years out from the march, such a defining moment in our history. How are you feeling in this moment as you reflect on the past 60 years of work for racial, economic, and social justice?
Well, I'll start by saying, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. I would like to start by saying I would have hoped we were further along than we are, which does not mean that we've not seen some progress over 60 years in relationship to the vision that my father enumerated of freedom and justice and equality for all humankind. But I can't imagine that he would have envisioned necessarily that in 2023, that our nation would be at loggerheads in relationship to fighting to protect and preserve democracy, fighting to expand the right to vote, to make it easier to vote as opposed to making it harder to vote, as some states have done, fighting to regain the right to choose, fighting just for people to have basic rights, the LGBTQIA community, and the list goes on and on. Now, the positive is that there are young people coming behind us who are determined and focused on getting our nation to a better place. We've got to reintroduce civility into the political space. That has been temporarily lost. It is not gone. So I think my mother and father certainly would be proud of certain things, certainly be so proud of our daughter, their granddaughter, who in her own way is choosing to carry on.
I agree. I honestly, I like to think of myself as a pretty hopeful person. And I would have to be honest that when we really are looking at this 60th anniversary, feeling very torn for all of the reasons that Martin mentioned. And to add on to what he said, about, our daughter, who is the only grandchild of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, when you think about that, she and her peers are literally sitting with fewer rights than the day that they were born. This generation, they've lost rights. And the reason that I say that is that she was born in 2008. In 2013, the Voting Rights Act, the crowning achievement of her grandparents' work, as well as all of those who worked with them, was basically decimated. And then when you look at in 2020, our home state here of Georgia, where she resides, was one of the states that passed initiatives to make it harder to vote rather than easier. And then when you think about the fact that here again in our state, there is an attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion being taught in school, and history being taught, clothed in attacks on critical race theory, which is something that's only taught to a few people that are in law school for a half of a semester. So when you look at the fact that here in the very state that her grandfather was born, history is being erased. And then, of course, when you look at last year in 2022, with the decision basically striking down Roe v. Wade, she, as a female, lost more rights for her reproductive freedom. So in a very real sense, this generation in their 15 short years have progressively lost rights, which is the antithesis of what a democracy, is and should be.
We're in this moment of great change. We're seeing so many Black leaders stepping up. We're seeing record numbers of Black candidates running, as well as Black women running. But at the same time, I think about what we saw happen in Tennessee with state representatives Justin Jones and Justin Pearson. I think about the conversations that I've had, for instance, with Representative Summer Lee, the first Black woman elected to the House from Pennsylvania, and the disparities that they're facing in this time. Does it seem like we keep hitting a wall every time we're right there with progress? And how do we deal with that?
You really almost have to understand that this scenario is not a sprint. I wish it was. It really is a marathon. And every time you think that we're there, my mother used to say, freedom has never been permanently given. Every generation must earn and actually move the pendulum forward. So, I always was hoping that maybe she was wrong, in a sense, because you would like to say, okay, we've done that, we're done. No, we're not. We have to get up almost every day and navigate through the world and really create the climate. I mean, that's probably more what's missing than anything else. We just kind of accepted a climate. For example, we've accepted a culture of violence. And so we see that emerging consistently, whether it's through video games, whether it's through movies and television, whether it's through music. And so until we create a different culture, a different model, I would like to see a culture, for example, of nonviolence, which teaches us how to live together without destroying personal property, which teaches us how to dialogue with one another without it going to the level of violence. And if we don't teach that, and we need to really, by the way, teach it from kindergarten all the way through high school and college, if we don't at least provide an alternative method of how to navigate through issues, we will destroy ourselves. We're almost at the point. Dad used to say, we must learn nonviolence or we may face non-existence. None of us want to get to that point, but we're at a critical point now where maybe people will say, you know what, there's a better way for us as human beings to coexist at a much higher level. But you cannot discount the work that was done back when George Floyd, back when Trayvon Martin was killed. All of these years, work has been happening, and we've made incremental progress, nowhere near where we need to be, by the way, but we have made progress. And I think you have to measure it that way. And also, finally, I would say that I know that if someone was to ask me, well, what do you think your father and mother would think? I think, quite frankly, they would be disappointed temporarily as we as a society exist. Now, the fact of the matter is that Dad lived, we would be on a totally different trajectory. He did not live to see his work complete. Therefore, we have a responsibility to work and create ultimately the climate for a better nation. He talked about America becoming the nation it ought to be, because many of us don't know when great was. I mean, great again. I don't understand that phrase, because I don't, in my knowledge, 50 years ago, not even that far, 60, 70 years ago, Black folk were being hung. But even in the 80s and 90s, Andrea worked on cases in the 90s where a young Black man had been hung. So how do you talk about greatness? You talk about the potential to become great, yes, but there was not a period that I know of where we were great. We exhibited moments of greatness, but we've not become great yet. We can become great, but we have to create that climate where every child can achieve their dreams, their goals. And that's what we're working toward.
And let me add as well, we witnessed in 2020 the beginning of a racial reckoning in this country. And I think that not many of us are surprised to see what we're seeing, which is, let's be truthful, a white backlash. Martin's father talked a lot about, like it's inevitable. You almost can set your clocks to whenever there's perceived progress, the inevitable backlash. And this country must deal with white supremacy. We have never fully dealt with it. We've gotten close on some levels. We've danced around it, and there's a way to do so in which it is healing, because it's not about collective guilt, but it is about collective responsibility. And I think, in a certain sense, this wouldn't be a total surprise to Martin Luther King Jr. nor Coretta Scott King, because we have to remember that he told us that the next phase of the civil rights movement would be for genuine equality. But he also said that would be a much more difficult phase, because when you're talking about integrating, lunch counter, when you're talking about integrating buses, as dangerous as that was, and we must never forget that people lost their lives in those battles. And he, as dangerous as those were, he knew that the next phase would be even more dangerous and even more difficult in challenging it. And that's where we are really as a nation and world. How do we all stand and work for genuine equality?
One of the things that you touched on was that folks lost their lives for us to be in this next phase of the civil rights movement. And I think about all of those that we have lost from, of course, your father, but then Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, names that we know, of course, but then many more that we see during the Black Lives Matter marches. What do you think causes this loss of life when we see this progress? Is it fear, or is it as simple as labeling it white supremacy?
Well, ultimately, I do think that we are in a period of transition, and we are literally midwifing or birthing a new way of being. And sometimes, in fact, most times, childbirth, a birthing process, as beautiful as it is messy and it's painful. And so the thing, again, as Martin said, that gives me hope. If we were seeing all of these things happening and no one standing up or no one standing together, I would be even more concerned. But the fact that you are seeing in a vast coalition, people standing up, standing together and saying, no, this is not what democracy is about. No, we will not, accept this. That is what ultimately gives me hope. And I think back a lot to the words of Gandhi, frankly, when he talked about when the times that he is, and I'm paraphrasing, but, the times when he feels a little bit hopeless or when he, gets concerned, that he looks back through history and he says that no matter what it looked like, the tyrants and hate never won. He said, and he even emphasized it. Think about that. Never, no matter what it looked like. No matter, when you're in the midst of something, it looked like hate and tyranny was winning. And certainly there's rising tides of hate, but in the end, it has never won. If you're looking at this country, whether you're looking at India, whether you're looking at Europe, whether you're looking at Africa, when you're looking at, South Africa, it has never, well, if it had one, then we would still be back during being enslaved. When you think about the civil rights movement, when you think about human rights movement, when you think about the movement in the 70s and 80s, when our gay and lesbian sisters and brothers were, saying, look, treat us, see us, treat us, love us. When you're looking at women's rights, it, always, this country, human existence is for expansion and fuller expression. And that has always won in the end. However, it has always won when people come together and demand it so.
And so, and I might only add a small point, which is, yes, it probably for some is fear. When people are afraid, they're easily controlled, they're easily manipulated. And it has been programmed, this fear against different points of view. And again, that's why I said that, we've allowed a tone, a culture of violence, and not chosen a culture of nonviolence, which humankind must do if humankind wants to survive. We've seen this movie before. All the civilizations that embraced fear, ultimately, which people said were great civilizations, they don't exist anymore. We as a civilization must become better if we're going to become bigger, or we could have that same fate. Now, that's not something we want to think about.
We're going to see a coalition this Saturday, August 26th, a sort of rededication to this movement, to fighting these three evils. Are there moments over the years, though, where you have felt that connection back to the very first March on Washington 60 years ago?
Well, first of all, let me say this. There was a lot of optimism that has been shared coming right off after the march, because it was the first time in the largest civil human rights demonstration ever. And, it was integrated, it was labor, it was religious leaders. And so people felt really, really good. Andrea talked about there's always this inevitable pushback. Less than 3 weeks after the march, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing occurred. So it thrust people back into, okay, this was a great start, but we've got still work to do. Now, today, where we are 60 years later, it seems like we're all going in, not all, but a lot of people going in a whole lot of different directions. Our goal is to bring people together for an agenda that teaches us. Dad and Mom taught us how to disagree without disagreeing, being disagreeable. And we've lost that temporarily. We have to reclaim and recreate that climate. I think that, if you talk to anyone back there who was living as a young person, I mean, there are many people, even in our legislative halls of Congress. It's interesting to see that folks have come to various positions today, and they were at the March on Washington and inspired, but they didn't quite maybe truly engage in the message fully. They engaged in a different way. I'm not suggesting these are bad people. I think Mitch McConnell, for example, I believe was one of those who was at the March on Washington. So, a lot of people claim they respect and admire Dr. King, but they don't totally get and understand the vision and embrace it to create a more broad, nation for all.
What's also interesting to me is, as this new generation and generations are taking the stage, one of my favorite signs that I've seen in the marches was in the 2020 march after George Floyd's murder. And there was a sign that said, my grandmother did it, and now it's my turn. And in a lot of ways, that, I believe, is the rallying cry for all of us, for all of us whose grandparents, parents, great-grandparents participated or wish they had participated. Now it's our turn to do so. I always say, if you think as always, has been a lot of debate of would you have marched with Dr. King? And everybody said that they would have. And, and it is all this discourse. And I always say, well, are you marching now? Because the stakes are just as high for all of us.
When we learned about the March on Washington, we learned about the I Have a Dream speech. But what do you think was the overall message that your father wanted folks to take away from the march? As you gear up for this year's March on the 26th, is there a new message that we need to take away?
Well, I don't think you can. Well, let me put it this way. There's always an ability to improve, but Dad's message, and one of the things I've said is, we hear with our ears, we listen with our heart. And what I mean by that is I have heard I Have a Dream thousands of times, but I've only listened hundreds. When I listen, I'm moved to tears. I don't care how many times I've heard it. When I'm listening is the only time that I'm impacted and I can't contain my emotions. If we can get our nation to hear and listen, we can perhaps make the changes to create a climate for freedom and justice and equality for all humankind. In other words, I don't know that message can be improved much. We just have to execute that message. And it resounds even maybe louder today than maybe it did, 60 years ago because of the particular climate and the conflicts in the world that we've got to navigate through. So in a real sense, I'm more encouraged because the coalition is growing and there are more people who are willing to say, look, we got to stand up, protect and preserve and expand not just our democracy, but in terms of, humankind in general. The courts, for example, which are challenging today in my judgment, we always used to go to the court for relief and expansion. Probably the first time in recent times where the court was used to retract and restrict was the Dobbs decision. And we've seen 2 or 3 things now.
Just now beginning.
Yeah, and this may just be the beginning of what the courts perhaps will do to try to turn the clock back. Again, that's based in fear. It's not just conservatism, because there are a lot of people who have conservative views and are conservative, but it doesn't have to be conservative and restrictive and push backward. We can still move forward as opposed to going backward. And that's, I think, what we have to do. It's creating the right climate. It's maybe even looking at expanding the courts. I mean, that's something, we haven't done that in over 100 years. When the courts were last expanded, we had about 40 million people. Now we've got 300 plus million people, and we still have the same number of justices at the Supreme level that we've had for all those years. So we need to at least be having dialogue on these issues, talking about an expansion. And that's part of this whole process. It really is dialogue, constructive, not destructive, but constructive dialogue.
When I think back to the theme of this year's march, I think back to the Old Testament and the passage of "Here comes that dreamer, come let's slay him, and then we shall see what becomes of his dream." And I feel that we have a moment at August 26th to show the world what can become of his dream. If you remember the refrain, "I have a dream," I think that the theme for this march is "I am the dream." And if we are the dream, what are we going to do to make real that dream? And it really is up to all of us. Mm-hmm. And I would also encourage, and also we're saying that August 28th certainly is a moment again of rededication, of marking that date, but it's not the ending, it's the beginning. It's the beginning of us coming together. It's the beginning of us knowing and embodying and being the dream and making that real here in our nation, in our world.
Thank you both just so much for your time today, your insight. I'm so appreciative of you taking this time to chat with me, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you on the 26th.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all that you're doing.
My next guest is Congressman Stephen Horsford, a Democrat from Nevada and chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. Thank you so much for being here, Congressman.
Thank you for having me.
So we are 60 years outside of the first March on Washington. Just tell me a little bit about what you're reflecting on in this moment.
Well, as you stated, the 60th commemoration, it's really a continuation of the fight for jobs and freedom, for justice and equality, something that leaders before us, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others, set as the priority for our country to live up to. And we're still fighting today to honor the commitment, the vision, the legacy of the 60th anniversary march. I'm proud to join with my colleagues from the Congressional Black Caucus who will be participating on the march on Saturday. The actual anniversary commemoration will be on Monday, but the march will be participating in Washington, D.C. This Saturday.
Yeah, and you know, one person that I think everybody thinks of at this moment is, of course, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but also I can't help but think of John Lewis, who at the time was in his 20s, and he got up on that stage and he spoke on behalf of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he had some strong words, including for the Kennedy administration. And you know, of course, we know that he would go on to be a champion for voting rights, especially in the House of Representatives, and I know that that's something really important to the CBC, especially this year. Can you just touch on why voting rights are so instrumental when we think about the March on Washington and the work that you guys are doing this year?
Yeah. Well, thank you for lifting up the late Congressman John Lewis, who will always remain as my hero and a civil rights icon for the work that he led as a civil rights leader, as a young student. It's always going to start with the young people, and throughout his career as a public servant in the House of Representatives. And as you noted, democracy is fragile. It's under attack. We are living through a moment right now when there are efforts to undermine education, particularly public education. The stacking of our courts and the decisions that are being made by the federal judiciary, including the United States Supreme Court. And then the most important right and institution within our democracy, which is our voting system and having fair and free elections, which sadly we are seeing being eroded by state legislatures, by now a four-time convicted former president of the United States, and others who still cannot agree that they lost the election in 2020. And yet we have another election that we need to prepare for and make sure is secure and protected.
Absolutely. And, you know, you touched a little bit on this, but I think one thing that is undeniable this year is there's been some debates over how to teach about Black history, about how to teach about or recognize Black identity. How does that, in your opinion, is it affecting how the CBC is approaching this commemoration this year?
Well, earlier this year in April, I convened a national summit on democracy and race. The Congressional Black Caucus convened leaders across the country in Washington. During that time, we talked about the issues from the erasure and the rewriting of history, including Black history, which is U.S. history. The undeniable fact that slavery is not a benefit that somehow helped people acquire skills, no matter what is suggested by Ron DeSantis and others in Florida. But beyond that, it's also the attacks on the expulsion of representatives like Justin Jones and Justin Pearson, out of Tennessee for speaking up for their constituents who want to be safe from gun violence in their communities. It's as I said, the packing of our federal judiciary. And that is why after that summit, we announced and just concluded, in fact, a summer of action called Democracy for the People through the Congressional Black Caucus Institute. And we traveled the country. We hit about 14 cities. Again, we will commemorate that at the 60th anniversary. And what we did is we had town hall meetings. We talked directly to the people that we represent. We had organizing sessions to help people understand their power and agency in this moment, and to really empower them with the tools and the resources that they need to organize in their local community, including to help with voter registration and voter turnout for next year. But nothing matters more than people understanding that this democracy belongs to all of us. It's not some archaic thing that only applies to a certain few, to the well-connected and to the well-off. It includes all of us. And the institutions of our democracy are the fundamentals that we're working to defend in this moment.
Yeah, and that kind of makes me think, you know, when we talk about the March on Washington, or when many of us learn about it in school, of course we hear about the I Have a Dream speech, you know, this seminal speech that was so important, but we often focus on that line about, you know, I have a dream, my children, you know, judged on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Looking back on the march, do you think that there are messages perhaps that we overlook that maybe we want to talk about or bring up more this year as we're looking at some of these attacks on Black history?
Well, I think a big part of what the march was 60 years ago and what it still remains today as priorities are around jobs. It's around economic opportunity. It's around fair and safe and secure housing. It's around wealth building in our communities so that there really is economic opportunity and prosperity that, again, is not just limited to the very few, but is something that is really promised to everyone, regardless of what zip code we live in. It is absolutely about education. And at a time when the Supreme Court would make a decision to deny and take away opportunities to have access to education because of the elimination of race-based preferences in affirmative action, we now have to do more to ensure that young people and parents alike know that education at this moment is critically important. And institutions like historically Black colleges and universities and minority-serving institutions have to be supported and funded so that those opportunities are available to everyone.
Yeah, and as you just mentioned, with the original March on Washington, you know, it was called March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I'm curious, how do we compare the two? How did those two link together? How do jobs influence freedom, or freedom influence jobs when we think about that?
Well, I just participated in a forum with leaders called the Black Economic Forum with the Executive Leadership Conference and other organizations, including the Black Economic Alliance. And I want to say this very clearly. You know, my job is to represent the Congressional Black Caucus, and we believe that when we uplift Black people, we uplift everybody. And that's something that Dr. King and others believed as well. We need economic policies in this country that help lift everyone out, and specifically Black people who, because of systemic racism, from enslavement to Jim Crow era policies to the mass incarceration of Black people to this day, we are still working to dismantle these institutions that have not provided equity and opportunity for everyone. That includes jobs. That includes the freedom for women to make their own healthcare decisions, and young people to be able to live in communities free from gun violence, and where climate is actually a priority, not just a talking point in a debate. So these are the things that we're still working on and fighting for. It's what the Congressional Black Caucus stands for as the conscience of the Congress. And while there may be people on the other side that are more focused on special interest, we're focused on putting people over politics.
And so going off of that then, you know, we've been in this fight since Africans were brought here as enslaved peoples. So looking at that, thinking about that, that was hundreds of years ago at this point. We're now 60 years outside of the March on Washington, which was 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. What words of advice or encouragement could you give, particularly when we're looking at young folks who are coming up now, not just in the streets and advocating, but also to the ballot box?
Thanks, Cheyenne. It's such an important question. And, you know, I did have the honor of joining Leader Jeffries earlier this year to go to Ghana as part of his first international trip as the leader in the House Democratic Party and caucus. And we visited the slave dungeons and sat at the steps of the door of no return. And so to suggest somehow we have not made progress, I reject that notion. I know we have. We've elected President Barack Obama. We have Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. You know, families are free to live largely where they want, and there are opportunities in education. But what we're fighting for is something bigger. It's not a floor. We're fighting for an opportunity for people to be able to live freely, to build legacy, to have wealth, to be able to pass down things to their children and their children's children. And that's simply what Black people want, like anyone else. So yes, it is about jobs, it's about freedom, and it's about the cornerstones of what produce a quality life. That is what Martin Luther King Jr. Fought for, spoke about, marched for, and it's why we are still continuing that march. I want to commend Dr. Martin Luther King III, as well as Reverend Al Sharpton, who are organizing this year's march. The Congressional Black Caucus stands as partners with them and other organizations. And this is a moment where all of us can do something to participate, to use our power, to encourage others to be involved in our democracy, to get out and vote, and to hold up this nation to live up to its ideals.
Absolutely. Congressman, thank you so much for your time and for your passion on this topic. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Look forward to seeing everybody at the march. Take care.
Joining me now is Mr. Cortland Cox, chairperson of the SNCC Legacy Project, as well as Mr. Derek Johnson, CEO and president of the NAACP. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for joining me today. We are here to talk about the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. So I want to start off. We are 60 years outside of when this march first took place. Talk to me first, Mr. Johnson, about where you think the progress has been since the first march to where we are today.
Well, we've made tremendous progress in the last 60 years, although there's a lot of work still to get done. You know, the path to freedom isn't a straight line. It's a pendulum that swings back and forward. And so because of the many individuals who gathered in 1963, but more importantly, the individuals who worked in local communities across the South, across the Northern territories that prevented equal protection under the law, that's the real deal. Because the march is a gathering to highlight what was taking place, but the real work was in communities across the country.
Mr. Cox, I understand you attended the march 60 years ago. Can you tell us what that moment was like? What do you remember?
Yeah, it's like correction. I was one of the organizers of the march.
One of the organizers.
Yeah, and one of the things that is important is that it's the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. So that you had two issues there, both jobs and freedoms. As President Johnson said, on the issue of dealing with the roadblocks of race, I mean, because we were stymied across the board, whether we're talking about education, housing, you know, being in office, political office, we've made tremendous gains in that game. What we have not done is the first part, jobs. And the question of what we're now having is a situation in the Black community, African-American community, where in fact you have a class of people who are billionaires, millionaires, and even thousandaires, you know, some like me, 100 years. But But in fact, there are lots of people who don't have Medicaid, lots of people who don't have food stamps. There are lots of people who don't have the kind of things that deal with the economic realities that they had to deal with. So as I look at the March on Washington, I think one part of it, in terms of ending the kinds of roadblocks that we had, have been eliminated. But the whole question of jobs really is a lot to be done. I'll stop there. I can talk about the day, but I'll stop there if you have another question.
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up on that because I think when we think about jobs and freedom, what's the connection between the two? How does jobs influence freedom, or freedom influence access to jobs?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the people who define the society, right? The people who define what is accessible and so forth, determine how things go. So my sense is, as we talk about freedom, I think really about politics, the ability to enter institutions and offices that creates various kinds of opportunities on the economic front. So when you look at what's happening in America today, the people politics is really about expression of economic interests. That's why people put so much money who are at the top into politics. And the problem is that the people at the bottom don't have the clout in the institutions that will make a difference in terms of their ability not only to access jobs, but to access government services. So in Mississippi and a number of places in the South, they refuse to deal with giving people Medicaid, So there is a connection, but you had to get the first one first. You had to have the barriers ended, the political barriers in particular, in order to begin to deal with the economic issues.
This is something I know that the NAACP has been discussing since its inception, is about particularly jobs, about generational wealth has come up, particularly when we talk about access to education. Looking at this moment, we can see that these things haven't been fully addressed. So 60 years later from the original March on Washington, where do we go? Where do we keep pushing, or how do we keep finding new ways to call for this accessibility, this equity, this equality?
So to be clear, the March on Washington 60 years ago was the stopping point between the work, but the work has been going on for centuries. The very reason why Africans were brought here was to exploit them for cheap and or free labor, dominating most of productions. When you look at the movement for human dignity, you're talking about a three-legged stool. Stool one, in a democracy, your vote is your currency. Our access to the ballot box, being able to operate as full citizens. African Americans in this country, we fought in every war. We prevented the breakup of the Union by defeating the Confederacy. No one saved us. We fought for liberation. As a result, we got 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So that first leg of that stool is about access to the ballot box, what Corlin was just talking about, and the vote and the power of the vote. That second stool was about the aspiration of the future, making sure there was access to a public education system. So if you look at the southern landscape particularly, the creation of public schools was the result of African Americans getting elected to office in the 1800s, and one of the first policy considerations was the creation of public education across the southern landscape. And then the third leg is the ability to negotiate for one's labor and skill, whether individually or collectively. That's a three-legged stool of the movement in this country for black people. And it's been going on for centuries, not just 60 years. The March on Washington was a culmination of many individuals and leaders coming together. It was intergenerational, so you had the senior leaders like Philip Randolph, you had individuals in between age like Vi Rushes, You had Cortland and his counterparts of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee members who all came together to highlight that this country had not fulfilled its commitment as guaranteed in the Constitution. So 60 years was a stopping point, but the fight will continue to go on as it had gone on prior to the March on Washington. There is no community more American than Black Americans. Despite all of the reneging of the promise, we still hold true to making democracy work is one of our primary responsibilities, and to ensure equal protection under the law. The beautiful thing about Cortland and the SNCC veterans, they focus narrowly on how do we empower more young people. You know, it's fascinating. He talked about the experience once he turned 30, he realized he was old. And that's how he treats the movement. Once a young person who's active, once they turn 30, he's looking for the next group of individuals, because we have to keep the pipeline of young activists to understand that they have a voice and a vote, and that they're owners of government, and they should never be victims of government.
I think about a lot of what we're seeing right now politically, both at the federal level, at the state level, when it comes to voting rights and attempts to suppress particularly Black voters. I think about some of the decisions, as you mentioned, that we've seen come down from the Supreme Court, but even decisions, for instance, on limiting what parts of Black history can be taught in schools. How does this affect this type of conversation when we're talking about bringing up the next leaders, when we talk about continuing to push forward with this movement? How do these moments affect that ability to do those things?
Well, it just rekindles the concept, what Cortland said earlier, that we are in the fight. We are in the fight to ensure that individuals are not put in office who run counter to what the future of this country should be, because they try to move us back to 1950s reality. You know, you think about the March on Washington, three things important came out of that. You had a group of individuals who went to the march, and they left, and they doubled down their dedications, and they went to a state like Mississippi. Cortland was one of those people, and they created a real strategy, because they realized, although the march was important, significant, and it felt good for some, but the people are going to go back and live in the same hell they left from. Right? And out of that, you get Freedom Summer. Out of that, you get the challenge to the Democratic Party and the notion of who will have access to the vote. But also out of that was the free speech movement and the women's suffrage movement. All of these things came out of it because it was a true demonstration that we individually have agency to give rise to what was necessary. And because of Freedom Summer, you get the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Because of Freedom Summer, you have the concept of community health centers all across the country now. Because of Freedom Summer, we recognize that the movement must be community-centric, not egocentric. It's never about the one person or the one speech. It's about the collective whole, putting in the work to ensure that equal protection under the law is afforded to everyone.
Mr. Johnson, you said something I want to come back to about it's not about the specific individual or a specific speech. And I know at the March on Washington, the part that everybody talks about, that we all learn about in school, is that was the moment we heard Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. But what else, and Mr. Cox, perhaps you want to address this, what else about that march or even about that specific speech do we overlook so often when we talk about that moment?
The speech I remember most is John Lewis's speech. Because when there were 250,000 people out there, John Lewis, Jim Foreman, myself, had to change John's speech because the Kennedy administration opposed his speech, because he was critical of the Kennedy administration. And one of the things about the speech in 1963 was he called for one person, one vote, which was a radical concept. But when I listened to King's speech, and there were all things going on there. I mean, when I was up on the stage, Marlon Brando was up there, and James Baldwin, and Charlton Heston, and every movie star you can think of, Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier. So it was hard for me to do both John's speech and look at all this going on and listen to Mahalia Jackson talk about, egging King on, tell him, Rev, tell him. And so there were a lot of things. But when I looked at the speech after, because I really couldn't understand it while all these things were going on, I think King answered the question that most white Americans were saying. And every time we did something, they would say, "What do you Negroes want?" And King said, "We have a dream that's deeply rooted in the American dream."
And I mean, in the speech, we focus on the dream, and the true essence of the speech is there's a promissory note called the Constitution, and we took it to the steps of justice, and it came back insufficient funds. That the very promise of this nation to its citizens, and we are human, we are citizens, are coming back to us insufficient funds. That's the fight we're in today. That's the fight that we must protect and continue moving into the future. Because at the end of the day, the march symbolized an intersecting point of local people and many others who were local leaders coming together, agreeing that this nation must recognize African Americans as Americans, and that we were entitled to all of the promises of the Constitution. That's the significance of the moment. It was the stopping point between the work, because people left there and they continued the work.
Let me just point one other point about the march. The march was organized in less than 90 days. Yes, wow. Less than 90 days. Brought 200,000 people here. I mean, the morning when I got up and I was walking the mall with Bayard Rustin, and we saw nobody. And Bayard turns around and said, what do we have here? And the problem was there were so many people coming in at the same time, the highways were clogged up. Nobody could get into town. And all of a sudden, all thousands and thousands, but less than 90 days. And the reason we were able to do it in less than 90 days, I think, was the work of the NAACP and the kind of magnet it was, because in the 50s, it was a criminal act to have an NAACP card in the Mississippi. And black people, that subterfuge, all that energy was there. So you were able to bring that energy together in 90 days. It took less than 90 days to put that march together.
It's incredible, absolutely incredible. Talk to me a little bit about what that organizing was like, because I'm trying to imagine in my brain, because as you mentioned, I mean, it wasn't just one person. You got Sidney Poitier up there with y'all. You got John Lewis. I mean
look, you have, so the key, and you had all the politics. A lot of people have, and Derek mentioned this earlier, A. Philip Randolph was, his name is not mentioned now but he was a towering figure. Mm-hmm. He was, he towered over everybody because he had the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And that it was his dream that they wanted to do the first march in 1941. That's right. And, to end segregation in the military. And then he was, Randolph was, they did the executive order desegregating the military, so that march did not happen. So it was 20 years later that this happened. And you've got not only that, it was a coalition. You had the NAACP, the Urban League, SCLC, SNCC, and CORE, in terms of civil rights, but then you had the Catholic Church, mm-hmm. then you had the Jewish community, mm-hmm. and then you had the Christian people. The only big thing that was missing, there were no women organizations, they were all kind of men kind of thing. And so you had people and labor was very big. Mm-hmm. So you had a group of people who could come together quickly. But then the question of transportation was huge. We had to, because it was very difficult to get the transportation, because one of the things I had to do was bring people from the South. And I had a big idea of having a freedom train. And, because traveling in the South was very difficult at that time. So I figured if they were all in one place on the train, it would be easier. But we couldn't get there. The railroad people didn't want to do it. And so we had to hire buses. But people, they came in school buses. They came in car. They just took because it's very dangerous traveling on the roads in the South. So, you had literally an explosion of people saying, and to quote Fannie Lou Hamer, people being sick and tired of being sick and tired. That was the energy that brought people to the march in less than 90 days. They were sick and tired of being sick and tired.
Was there a moment at all during the day when you're there, when you're up on stage? Because as you mentioned, it wasn't safe for some of these people to come up, but were you worried actually at the march, standing there in the shadow of the memorial? Was there any concern then?
I mean, we were so far up. I was up on the stage in the Lincoln Memorial, so it was hard for me to interact with and see people. I mean, one of the things that happened is, and I'm sure people are embarrassed, that people were so energized. You know, it was supposed to be the leadership, you know, holding hands and you know, and being in front of the march. People started marching without the leadership, so they had to run and catch up with them. Because people were just, hey, we're here to make our statement. And this is not about leaders, not because King called us, it's not because, you know, Roy Wilkins called us, not because, you know, Jim Farmer called us or anybody. We're just sick and tired of being sick and tired.
And I know we're running close on our time, but I wanted to ask, because I know August 26th, there's going to be another march here in D.C. that's acknowledging, commemorating, continuing the march from 60 years ago. But as we've talked about today, it's more than just marching. It's more than just hitting the streets and putting our signs in the air. Where do you want to see? I know we have an election coming up, 2024, which for some folks feels far away, but for a lot of us, it's tomorrow. It's right around the corner. Where do you want to see young folks putting their time and energy into outside of marches like what we're going to see on the 26th?
For the NAACP, everything we're doing is in preparation for November 2024. Everything. Because that election would define the future of America in ways in which no other election has defined the future. Who sits in the White House will determine if we're going to be a country looking forward, embracing the diverse population that we have grown to become, or will we have someone sitting in that seat seeking to make us a 1950 reality, which is impossible to do, which will cause harm to far too many communities. For young people, them understanding what that truly means to their future. For young African-American kids, for young people, it would either allow you to advance a future that's consistent with what your interests are and your talents develop to be, or it would limit your possibilities. That's what's at stake. November 2024 is not a long way away. It is right around the corner, and for young people, we must engage because that election will determine the future of this country and the opportunities for young people in our community.
I think that there's quite a few people, both black, brown, white, who will say, well, there's nothing left to fight for. We had a black president. We're good, right? Like, we hear that a lot. Oh, you guys had Obama. Aren't you fine now? Aren't you happy? Oh, you have Kamala Harris. You have Ketanji Brown Jackson. They can name these names. Mm-hmm. How do we tell folks the fight isn't over? There's still more left to do.
For many people, they just look at their surroundings. Until we close the disparity gaps, the dealing with income, education, opportunity, there's more to fight for. You know, when you think about that three-legged stool I talked about earlier, access to voting is the paramount. We have many states and governors who are trying to limit access to voting for African Americans and other communities. When you think about that second leg, quality education for all children, you have far too many young people being born in zip codes that would permanently lock them out of the exposure of a quality education. And the ability to negotiate for one's skill, labor, individually or collectively, we are seeing strikes bubble up, whether it's the writer's guild or the actors or many others, because people are not being paid their fair wage. Now, you have the billionaire class making tons of money, and yet you have far too many individuals who are hard-pressed to make a livable wage. That's what the reality is, and that's what the fight is about. Those three legs, and everything else germinate from there.
Yeah, and I would remind people the March in Washington was for jobs and freedom. And one of the things that even though a number of the racial barriers are gone, we see even outside our community, UPS people talking about, you know, the wages and the way the relationship. You're talking about American Airlines. I know people in Delta Airlines. You know, we're talking about the Screenwriters Guild. So the question, the economic question, is the fundamental question. And to me, the question of who gets involved and who shares is something that is really going to be, as was said, ongoing. And we not only see it in our communities, we see it across America. Because as we now say, we have billionaires who think that America is their plaything, and the Supreme Court is their plaything, and so forth. So therefore, we need to understand that those of us who are not in that class and those of us who have to live in America have to be the people who are going to make the difference.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Mr. Derek Johnson, CEO and President of the NAACP, and Mr. Cortland Cox, Chairperson of the SNCC Legacy Project, thank you both so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Governor Wes Moore, thank you so much for being here today. Appreciate this.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So we are 60 years outside of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And I can't help but think about the progress that we've made when I think about, obviously, we saw the Civil Rights Act, 1964. We saw end of Jim Crow legally. We saw Barack Obama. Now we have Kamala Harris, Ketanji Brown Jackson. We have you. Let's talk a little bit about some of the progress that we've made and how you've seen it, or how you picture this progress over the past 60 years.
You know, I remember the morning of our inauguration, where I was very, very intentional about how I wanted that day to play out, where we actually started the day down at the Annapolis docks. And we started the day down at the Annapolis docks because while it's beautiful, it's also one of the oldest slave ports in the United States of America. And we started the day by doing a wreath laying ceremony down there. And then I, along with my lieutenant governor and my family, and a couple hundred other people, we marched from the docks to the State House. A State House that is one of the oldest, that is the oldest operating state house in the country, that was built by enslaved people. And it was there that I was sworn in as the 63rd governor of the state of Maryland. And I wanted to do it because there is a power in understanding the journey. And there is a power in understanding that progress has been made. It's been uneven. It's been choppy, and it's been painful progress. But it's been progress, and earned progress. I think the thing we also wanted to remind people and remember is that the progress cannot be also seen in individuals and seats and that type of thing, where I was, yes, being sworn in as the first African-American governor in the history of the state of Maryland, and only the third African-American governor elected in the history of the United States. But I was also very clear, but that's not the assignment, right? The assignment wasn't getting to the State House and being elected governor. The assignment wasn't making history. The assignment is the work that you can do once you're in the seat. And that's the focus that I think that we've all tried to keep when it comes to, now that you have a moment when the policies that in so many cases have both elevated and also diminished, how, when you actually have a chance to be in the seat, can you be very intentional about creating policies that can create long-term and sustainable economic growth?
Yeah, and I want to touch on that briefly, that history of Maryland that you mentioned, because we know that there has been, in some ways, a bit of a brutal history with Black Americans in Maryland. And then, as you mentioned, you were the third Black governor, only ever elected, the first in Maryland. What does that say about particularly the course of Maryland on this charting toward progress?
Yeah. I mean, I think about, for our state, I mean, Maryland is the home of Thurgood Marshall and Cab Calloway and Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. And it's also the home of redlining. It's also the home of discriminatory housing and transportation policies that have been some of the greatest wealth thefts that we have seen within our society. It's also, it's also the home of Antietam and some of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. Our history is complicated. And it's a complicated history of a state and a complicated country when it comes to the issue of race relations and economic growth. The thing that I also know, and why I feel that sense of power, is, inside my office, there's a picture of, I keep a picture of Frederick Douglass. And I position it specifically in my office where it actually looks like he's looking down at my desk. And I do it because as I'm sitting on my desk, I will look up at the picture and think about the decisions that I'm making. And it's almost like what would he say about this moment? What would he say about the decisions that I'm about to make? And I think us being able to understand the shoulders that we're standing on, us being able to understand the moment that we find ourselves in, and us being able to understand that it's not just that history is judging us right now. The future is judging us and is really thinking about, are we actually capturing a moment and making each and every day matter in the way that those who came before us did? And so I think that is both it's both a burden that we have in the state of Maryland that I know is not unique to the state of Maryland, but there's some unique qualities of the history of inequity in the state of Maryland. Yet at the same time, I think it is that weight that actually creates the opportunity for us to be able to do some powerful things going forward.
I'm looking at, we're here 60 years again, and even though we've had this progress, I think, as you mentioned, we're in a very, I would say, precarious moment at this time where we're seeing these successes. But at the same time, we're also, I think, watching a little bit of a battle play out right now, especially when it comes to our culture and Black history and Black culture and Black figures. We're seeing violence perpetuated against Black Americans, both physically and politically at this point. We just recognized the 1-year anniversary of the shooting at the Top supermarket, while we're also watching book bannings around the nation and predominantly GOP-led areas. What is this moment as we're fighting for progress, but also finding hindrance in other areas? How do we reconcile with that?
I think we have to reconcile by being very intentional about pushing back. Our history is our strength. Our history is our foundation. Our history is the thing that reminds us every single day that nothing is impossible. That no matter what it is that we are facing, you can look back at your history and understand, both as a nation, but also for African Americans and people of color and anyone who's been part of marginalized communities as a people, that the progress that has been made has been hard fought. And you might see dark days right now, but I can guarantee this: those who came before you saw dark days too, and they persevered. And because they persevered, we're able to stand here in our presence. And I think the danger that we're seeing of the banning of history, the book bans, and I would say it's not even just what we're talking about when it comes to Africans. It's not just the fact that we have districts now that are banning Beloved and banning The Bluest Eye and banning books against Hank Aaron. Right? It's not just that. It's when we're watching the banning of books about the Holocaust. It's when we're watching students under investigation because they're writing book reports on Stonewall. It's why we're cutting curriculum about Japanese internment camps. When you are doing that, it's not, and there's this excuse that's being made that, we're doing it because we don't want students to feel discomfort, or we don't want students to feel guilt. That's not true. It's not that. It's not that they don't want certain students feeling guilt. It's that they don't want all students feeling empowered. Because when you know your history, nothing intimidates you. I don't flinch. And I don't flinch because I know my history. I know where I come from, and I'm proud of where I come from. And that's why I approach the world in the way that I approach the world. And all we're simply asking is that for every single person, regardless of their background, regardless of their family lineage, regardless of who they are in their own skin, I want them to walk through life feeling empowered. I want them walking through life feeling welcomed. I want them walking through life feeling supported. And the best way you can do that is by making sure that they know the shoulders they are standing on. If you do that, nothing is impossible. And so I think we have to be aggressive when it comes to this, because it's not just it's not just anti-intellectual, right? It's past that. It's actually beginning to deteriorate the fundamental strength that we have in our communities that's going to give us the power in order to move forward in a productive and a consolidated way.
You talk about being aggressive when we see some of these policies. What does that look like to you?
Well, I think it looks like a few different things. One is I think we have to be able to strengthen laws that prohibit this. It's the reason that we, are not only looking at laws about things we can do to ban, this idea of book banning and censoring of history, but it's also the reason why I joined up with 8 other governors and went to the publishers and said, we need you all to push back against this as well. These publishers who are now in battles with elected officials about what of their content and what of their curriculum can people actually read, process, understand, and learn. The second, though, piece is I think we need to make bigotry expensive. I think when you have states that are doing things like book banning, I think when you have states that are doing things like restricting a person's right to be able to have reproductive health, I think we need to make bigotry expensive. And so for businesses that are doing business in those states, for people that are choosing to do conferences in those states, for teachers who now are under investigation for educating their students, I say this: come to Maryland. Come to a state that welcomes you. Come to a state that actually embraces all people and aspects of its society. And for those who are choosing to restrict rights, for those who are choosing to restrict knowledge and restrict access to information, I think we need to make we need to make their decisions very expensive, because they will watch businesses, they will watch individuals, they will watch their citizens choose to go elsewhere. Make bigotry expensive.
One thing that I think about at this time, as we're approaching the march, the history of the march, and we think about one of the phrases that continuously comes up recently is Martin Luther King's infamous, famous, iconic, legendary phrase about the moral arc of justice. It's long, but it bends toward justice. Mm-hmm. And where we are right now, what words, I know you recently spoke at Morehouse, what words would you give students right now as they're on that bend, trying to push toward that justice that we heard MLK speak of?
I would say the moral arc does bend towards justice, but not because of inevitability. It's because of courage. It doesn't do it because of gravity. It doesn't do it because a next generation moves on. It does it because of courage. And that's the only thing it's ever done. When you think about every single movement that has taken place, every single bit of progress that we have seen, there's one thing that's always tied to it. It's names of people, right? It's people who actually chose to make that progress happen. You can't understand whether we're talking about women's suffrage, whether we're talking about the civil rights movement, whether we're talking about the Love is Love movement. There are names attached to it, names of heroes and sheroes, right? Of people who decided enough. And I am willing to give it all in order to make sure that our society can be better. And so I think that we do, and we historically have seen this moral arc bend towards justice, but it really is because people have been pulling it that way, and not because people were waiting for it to turn. Because when we see people who just sit there and wait for history to happen, history has a very dangerous way of turning in a different type of direction. And so we've got to be active participants in our democracy. We've got to be active participants in our future, because that's how progress actually happens.
We're in a moment. We have always been in a moment, and those moments lead to movements. Where is this movement for civil rights right now in your mind?
I think the movement for civil rights is really focusing and needs to focus on economics. We set as a North Star for both our campaign and now the North Star for the Moore-Miller administration in the state of Maryland. This is about work, wages, and wealth, right? And it's about all three. It's about how do we come up with foundational and functional ways for people to have access to work, that we're actually having an education system that's training people how not just to be employees, but how to be employers, that we're creating pathways for people to be able to enter into a workforce. And we don't think that a four-year college is the only way for people to be able to do so, that we want to have real ways of job training and job reskilling for people to be able to participate in a rapidly growing and evolving economy, that we want to make sure that people are getting paid fair wages for their work. And gone should be the days when we have people people who are working jobs, in some cases multiple jobs, and still living at or below a poverty line. And we need to focus on wealth, generational wealth, the ability to pass something off to your children besides debt, the ability to own more than you owe. Right? This idea that we want to create an ownership society, because it's never going to simply be about how are we increasing income or addressing an income gap if you still have a massive wealth gap, because that's what's lasting, that's what's sustainable. And so I think the next phase of what we're talking about, it really is about economics. It's about pathways to work, wages, and wealth. And I think that is the next crucible.
And that's something that was important to Dr. King as well. He talked about, starting the Poor People's Campaign.
That's exactly right.
As we wrap up here, reflecting back again to what this march was about, what it symbolized, what are you reflecting on this year as we're approaching this anniversary?
I'm reflecting on not just the courage of Dr. King and the power and the fact that people oftentimes celebrate his oratory. But the amazing thing about Dr. King is he was a person who had no patience for just talk, right? That one of the greatest speakers of the century was probably also one of the most impatient. That it wasn't that he had no interest in hearing people talk about what they want to do. You actually had to go out there and do it. But I also reflect on the fact that while Dr. King is oftentimes the name that people remember, he wasn't alone. He was surrounded and he was protected, right? He was surrounded by a series of activists and leaders and family members and people in the ministry and government workers and teachers and nurses and people who all had the same common cause and who were all bought into the same common vision. And so I think, in this moment, I'm thankful for the work of Dr. King. I'm thankful for the work of many of the civil rights leaders, but I'm also thankful for the names we don't know and the people who pushed just as hard to make sure that that moral arc was actually bending in the right way.
Governor Wes Moore of Maryland, thank you so much to be here reflecting on this anniversary with me today.
Bless you. It's my pleasure. Thank you for your leadership.
Thanks again to Governor Wes Moore of Maryland for chatting with me. And now, our final guest needs no introduction. The Reverend Al Sharpton is the founder and president of the National Action Network, or NAN. NAN has been marching and fighting for civil rights since 1991. Reverend Sharpton joined the Switch Up recently to talk about the anniversary of the march. Take a listen. Reverend, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I want to start off, first, we're 60 years out from when this first march took place, this March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. What progress have we made so far, but where are we still lacking?
We, in 1963, when they had the march, they were marching at a time that there were still laws of segregation in the South. There was the strict Jim Crow that governed life in the country. Even in the North, there were aspects of it. There was the denial of the right to vote in most parts of the South for black people. There was, of course, therefore, the social ramifications of that. That march in '63 came after there had been student sit-ins and there had been the assassination of Medgar Evers that June, and there had been things leading up to A. Philip Randolph, the labor leader, calling this march, and the NAACP, National Urban League, Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they called them the Big Six, came together. And that march demonstrated the mass outrage of people of what was going on at that time. And you must remember, I think a lot of people forget, 250,000 people coming to Washington when they could not ride the front of buses above the Mason-Dixie line, when they couldn't use most restaurants along the road if you were black, where they couldn't use toilets in public places, yet they came anyway. So I think that mass outpouring showed the nation the outrage people had which I think helped lead to the 64 voting rights, the Public Accommodations Act, the Civil Rights Act, which was only a year later, and then the Voting Rights Act 2 years later. We made progress. We now have, in effect, taken Jim Crow down. The Public Accommodations Act, the Civil Rights Act, where now in 60 years later, we can fly first class, not only ride the front of a bus. We can check in 5-star hotels if we have the money. We have public accommodations for the most part. We have the right to vote. We've elected a black president and re-elected him. We now have a vice president who is a woman of color, black woman. We have black corporate leaders. We have black billionaires. We have blacks in mainstream entertainment. So to say we haven't made progress is not true. But if you look at the en masse numbers, we are just as unemployed statistically. We almost double that of whites. We still have, in many states, the erosion of voting rights, where it's making it more difficult to vote.
I think what really stands out to me that you were just highlighting is how multiracial this march on the 26th, as you said, continuing the march for the 60 years is going to be. And that's absolutely incredible. I'd like to hear from you what, in this moment, the spirit of this march is. You mentioned, 60 years ago there was frustration, there was anger. How do you see the spirit of this year's march comparing to the one 60 years ago?
There is a lot of concern and some anger. When you wake up one morning and you're a woman and you no longer have the right to decide your body, that can cause anger. When you wake up one morning and have been told that some of your student debt is forgiven and the Supreme Court says the president can't do that, that could lead to anger. When you wake up one morning and all of a sudden the fact that your family, because you are a certain color, couldn't advance in education, so there was going to be affirmative action to try and equalize that gap in terms of being locked out of higher education. And all of a sudden they say, no, you can't do that. And they say that it is against the 14th Amendment to deal with the question of race. Well, then how do we deal with the racial gap? We're not behind because there was something genetically wrong with us. We're behind because by law, government-enforced law, we couldn't go to certain schools. We didn't have access to certain things. So all of that ends, that could lead to anger. Our job is to channel that anger into constructive activism rather than destructive, saying we're going to just explode or implode. No, it's about being active in a constructive way, which is why Martin and Andrea and the rest of us in National Action Network have called this march.
What we're seeing right now is we're seeing some of those things. You mentioned Rosa Parks, and some of these names are being said, we can't talk about race in schools. We're not going to talk about identity. You can't talk that Rosa Parks was, arrested because of the law at that time. How does this affect the fight today for progress, but how did it affect even thinking about bringing this march together?
I think so much about when I see the try to remove black history, LGBT discussions, women history. It's almost like if we shut this down, people will not understand why we need to continue to make progress. So if you have a Governor DeSantis in Florida trying to make certain laws against certain books or banning certain books in other parts of the country, then the only conclusion you could have is that blacks were just inherently inferior. So we don't only need black history for black young kids. White kids need to understand what happened, and therefore we need to do these things now. It is depriving whites of understanding how we ended up in a society that we have different needs based on different circumstances. It's not to condemn people, it is to understand people so that we can move and equalize and work together. I never thought I would see a time where people would celebrate trying to erase and edit history. And I've been able to live through some of it. I joined the civil rights movement in the North. I was not born in the South when I was 12 years old. And I lived to speak at Rosa Parks' funeral, and Aretha Franklin's, and James Brown, and Michael Jackson. So I'm looking at black history that I was able to live through. I was in South Africa when Mandela won for president, and I sat on the podium when Barack Obama was inaugurated first black president. So I feel an obligation to protect the history that even in my small part was a part of. And you're going to tell me we're not going to be able to tell those stories because that might make people uncomfortable? No, we need to tell people that despite the fact we were chattel slaves, we were able to struggle and get to a black president. That can be a glorious story, but you take the glory out of the story when you want to take the pain and the suffering out. And the whites that stood up as abolitionists with Frederick Douglass, and that 100 years later marched with Martin Luther King. Tell the whole story. Anytime you have an edited story, you underestimate the intellect and ability of American people to understand our growth.
Yeah. Looking back, the March 60 years ago, you said it was March for Jobs and Freedom. What do those two ideas have to do with each other? But more than that, I think about freedom and the way people use it. What does freedom mean today when we talk about equality, when we talk about equity?
Freedom then meant being able to use public accommodations, being able to get a job to feed your family. Freedom today, in many ways, represents some growth of the same thing. It means the freedom to be equal to anyone else. Education, not being banned from certain access to higher education. So let me get this right. The Supreme Court says you cannot consider race as a factor, even though until a couple of generations ago you excluded. But you can be considered with legacy. Well, why do some people have legacies at higher education? Because their family had wealth that we couldn't have, and they could give money that we couldn't give, or their family could go to schools when we couldn't. That legacy was built in segregation. That legacy was built in elimination of certain people's rights. So you combine the students in some of these high institutions that got there because of race was a factor. It wasn't the only factor because they had to have the grades and all the rest. If you took them numbers and compared it to the numbers of students that were there on legacy, the legacy would far outnumber them. Isn't it interesting that the Supreme Court didn't see anything wrong with that? And they didn't see anything wrong with race being a factor in the military. So I can go to the bunker, but I can't go to the dormitory. That is crazy. And that's why we're marching. That's what we're talking about freedom now. Jobs, we're talking about we want the same ability to be able to go and get a job fairly that we were denied and that our parents and their parents were denied. 13 state attorney generals have written letters to 100 of the top Fortune 500 companies since the Supreme Court decision a few weeks ago, saying that you can no longer consider race in diversity, DEI programs. This is already happening. This is not a maybe this will happen if we don't march. No, this has already happened, which is why we march.
I think a lot about what we're seeing right now, the way that identities are being so highly politicized and these attacks that are happening at the same point. Why do you think there seems to be, for some folks, it feels like a resurgence of a lot of this hate, of as you said, with the Supreme Court rolling back these rights? Now we're saying, don't consider race, when you mentioned not even a full generation ago, they were considering race to not hire people, not let them in schools. What's causing this sudden renewed interest in this?
I think that there was this built-up resentment that people felt that they were threatened and their so-called superior position threatened them, and people played on that insecurity and just brought out what was subliminally inside. Donald Trump became the face of it, but he's not the cause of it. He brought out, there were some elements there that had never died. And I think Trump made it acceptable because he brought it to a presidential level, talking about S-hole countries and referring to people in a disparaging way, and women and disabled. So Trump, in many ways, was able to mainstream what people in the 60s and 50s and 40s could only do in the margins. When I was growing up, and I remember in '64, I was still a teenager, where Barry Goldwater was the Republican nominee. In your heart, you know I'm right. He implied certain things against Lyndon Johnson, who was pro-civil rights. Donald Trump said it straight out. Donald Trump bragged about, I put the Supreme Court justices there that did this to women's right to choose, that did this to affirmative action. It's become Main Street, which is why on August 26th, we coming down Main Street to say that you can turn back the clock, but you won't turn back time.
I think about the role of young people, and one of the moments that we think about with young people is thinking back on Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in his speech talking about his children and the dream that he had for his children to be judged on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And I'm curious for you, that element of his speech is so constantly said in so many ways, including in the affirmative action case. We had heard supporters quote him in that. But what from that speech, in your mind, is overlooked at the same time when people are pulling that quote out?
I think that, you know, I'm a preacher and been one since I was a child. The I have a dream part, and then part of what you quoted, was the climax of the speech. What people miss is the meat of the speech, the content. He talked about, first of all, why was the march at Lincoln Memorial? And why is ours at Lincoln Memorial? Why wasn't it at the Washington Monument or the Jefferson Memorial? If you look at the speech, he said 100 years ago, 1963, 100 years ago, 1863, Mr. Lincoln, Lincoln Memorial, we're in the shadows of Mr. Lincoln. You signed the Emancipation Proclamation. You promised that we'd have equality. You promised freedom. Washington didn't make that promise. Jefferson didn't make that promise. That's why we go to Lincoln Memorial. That's why he went 100 years later in '63. That's why we go in there in 2023. What we miss is he said that America has given us, Mr. Lincoln, a promissory note that has bounced in the Bank of Justice. We missed that part. We are living in a time where we're asking America to live up to your promise. And we leave that out because to talk about that part of the speech, the bounced check, the unfulfilled promissory note, is to then have to deal with policy rather than poetry. We like the poetry. I have a dream. My four little children, that's good poetry. But what about the bounced check? What about the equality? What about the fairness? What about being able to have the same equal footing? That challenges us to do something. And I think, you know, Mrs. King, his widow, that Martin III, when we became close and worked together for the last 25 years, his mother spent time kind of helping all of us, especially we get some of our rough edges off. And she used to say that don't just talk about the end of the speech, talk about the whole speech. And it's that content that we intend to drive on August 26th.
My last question for you. We have been in this fight, I think about, Frederick Douglass. You can go all the way back to the time that our ancestors were brought here. And as you yourself mentioned, you have been part of this movement since you were 12. What words of advice or hope or encouragement can you give folks today, in spite of attacks that we're seeing on Black history, on Black bodies, on Black voting rights? What do you want folks to feel, particularly coming out of your march?
The movement is a struggle, and the struggle is about a long-distance run. It's not going to be a 50-yard dash. So if history teaches us anything, you're going to make an advancement, and they're going to try to push you back. And you got to get used to the rhythm of struggle, forward, back, and keep going forward, back, and expect that. We were elated when Barack Obama was elected president. Never thought I'd see that in my lifetime. But it was followed by Donald Trump, which was the antithesis of that. We should have expected there was going to be some answer. So you don't not only give up because they push back, you expect to push back. So now you come with the answer to the pushback. That always happens. Dr. King, we started this conversation. Dr. King and others 6 years ago had their march. You know what happened right after the march? About a month and a half after the march, after 250,000 people, this tremendous march, I Have a Dream speech, they bombed the church in Birmingham and killed 4 girls during Sunday school. They could have said, after all of that, how could you do that? But they said, we're going to wipe our tears and keep going, and they still got the Civil Rights Act less than a year later. So there's going to be reaction. You prepare for the reaction, and you got to be stronger in your action than whatever reaction come your way. So yes, it is very precarious times that we're in, but look at where we came from. In 100 years, we went from being property where we didn't even know our names. Our names are the names of our slave master. I went and we researched it, the New York Daily News. My family was owned by Alexander Sharpton in Edgefield, South Carolina. I don't know my name. I know the name of my slave master. But I took his name in going out of the White House and negotiating for our people. That's a long journey in a century. We must continue that journey. You can't give up. We are stronger than they think we are. The only weakness we have is if we have a self-image of our being weaker than we really are.
Thank you so much to the Reverend Al Sharpton here talking about the March on Washington, but more than that, leaving us with a wonderful inspirational message on how we continue forward. Reverend, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
And that brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to all of our guests and to all of you for watching. For those of you who missed any of the conversations this afternoon, we will have video from the event up on our website, thehill.com, shortly. And please remember to subscribe to the Switch Up podcast. Links to find the Switch Up on major podcast platforms will be in the description on this video on YouTube and on thehill.com. I'm Cheyenne Daniels. Hope you enjoyed the program and have a great rest of your day.